O tranquility, penetrating the very rock, a cicada's voice. Welcome back to Language of the Soul, conversations on healing and growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, opening the episode today was a haiku, a poem from Matsuo Basho, a famous Japanese poet living in the 15th century. This is actually a piece that begins Martin's book, Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity. And it's tied in to the concept of Shoshin. Martin, what is Shoshin?
The simplest of translations offers Shoshin as beginner's mind. In his book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Shunryu Suzuki, a Zen teacher, describes it as, if your mind is empty, it is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few.
Ah, mm, evocative statement.
Before we even begin a conversation around Shoshin, I want to begin by actually apologizing to the community of people who've been listening to this podcast. I want to apologize for not showing up in a fully evocative, fully expressive voice. I've been holding back. And so if I take the elements of an authentic apology from my book, I break down, in essence, an apology into three key elements. The first is acknowledging in full what it is I'm apologizing for. Well, I'm apologizing for holding back, for not, in essence, being willing to go for it, whatever going for it means in that moment. And in this context of a podcast, it's not going into the edges, but holding back under the auspices that it'll be more acceptable, it'll be more understandable. No more. I'm going to go to the edges and let the cards, as the expression goes, fall where they may. The second part of an authentic apology is expressing remorse. And I'm expressing remorse for the sake of myself, but also for everyone who's listening, because you deserve the best possible podcast I can offer, that Ben and I can offer. And my remorse is that in holding back, I've given far less than I'm capable of giving. And lastly, for the sake of being clear in communicating how I intend to remedy this, I intend to move forward fully with the intention of evoking from within myself what I fully have to offer. It's a practice. At times, I'll do it particularly well, and other times, not so much. And I'll need to keep practicing so that I can get better at it. And that right there speaks directly to what Suzuki is speaking to when he says, In beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert mind, there are few. I have no intention of being an expert. I do, though, have an intention to share with you my own version of genius. And that word genius meaning that not that I'm on a pedestal. Oh, my genius, I'm smarter than everyone else. Not that meaning of genius, but the genius that we all have in ourselves that makes us unique. There's a unique Ben, there's a unique Martin. There's a unique way that we're called to express ourselves in this life. And that, in many ways, is what I'm seeking in this offering of an apology, is to make that promise to you to express my genius into this work, into this creative work that is a podcast. And in that way, shed this notion that there's an expert in this conversation. And in the context of the larger conversation that we're sharing today, which is that of Shoshin, to enter into a conversation that's very closely connected to what is known as child's mind. The idea that we can explore life through wonderment, through curiosity, that we can allow ourselves the space to see life anew, which is one of the key elements of Shoshin through beginner's mind, is the willingness to practice life as if each new moment is truly what it is, new. And that requires a practice to be willing to be here, no matter what the pain, no matter what the suffering, no matter what's going on, no matter what anything in our lives is going on, we're showing up for the possibility that the new moment is providing us something truly extraordinary.
It's that inherent genius within oneself that goes, there is space for all of it. You can feel that pain and you can be curious about the moment that you're in that's unfolding, another one unfolding, another one unfolding. There's an abundance to the beginner's mind that does go back to what Suzuki said, many possibilities. And many possibilities may even be a somewhat finite, rational way of saying it. Because in that inner experience of wonderment, of curiosity, of knowing that one's own genius is infinite, how we choose to express it in each moment ends up translating into something finite. But that's the delicious nature of the mystery, how we choose to honor the abundance.
And how we embrace each and every time that we, in essence, fail. And not to stigmatize failure, to make failure an okay word in our nomenclature. That failure isn't the final say. Failure is a step along the way.
We trip.
We trip. We're going to trip over and over again.
Yeah.
And I don't care whom we're speaking of. I don't care who it is. They've all failed over and over and over again. And if they're really good at it, they're still failing because they're still working with the edges of their work. In other words, I don't care who it is. No one arrives. No one steps into and goes, "Oh, I'm here." No, there's a here, and then there's a new moment to grow, a new moment to heal, a new moment for wonderment, curiosity, a new moment in connection with others where we can listen more deeply. We can listen more openly in ways that allow us to create understanding, empathy, intuitive connection, rather than, as the saying goes, listening to respond. Letting go of the idea that without that deep willingness to really step into the moment through curiosity, you're really not here for the sake of whomever you're communicating with. And if you're not willing to be there, maybe it's not a conversation worth having.
I'd like to ask if you can bring up particular example that listeners might be able to all share. You know, we live in a very particular climate in the United States, it being an election year, all of these divisions and these battles and these things. Is there something that we can look at within that framework? This universal knowledge of our inherent genius, this curiosity, this wonderment, and how divisions have, in large measure, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten how to tap into that because everyone wants to be the expert. Everyone wants to dominate over someone else in some way, shape, or
Well,
form.
let me play angel's advocate with you and suggest that, sure, in the larger political and social environment, there is that element that individuals are, in essence, always trying to outdo the other. They're trying to, have that quick, easy answer that silences the other. And that's, in essence, what we're doing in that kind of discourse, right? But that's not the conversation I really think that most people are hungering for.
No.
But and what I mean by that is in the workspace, how do we get our voice to be heard in a way that says, I respect my coworker, I respect my the person working with me, for me, or with whom I'm working for, and whatever hierarchical system we're in. How do I find a way that my inherent genius finds expression? Because when that happens, we feel nourished because our voice has been expressed into our environment. How do we allow that to be? And in part, it's recognizing that it's not a competition.
Yes.
That's what listening to respond turns every communication into a competition. Who's going to win the conversation? And it isn't that it just exists in political and social discourse. It occurs in workplaces. It occurs in all of our social discourses. It's become so commonplace that everything has become, how can I outdo the other rather than how can I deepen the connection?
Now, would you characterize that need to win in all avenues of social life being a part of what we've talked about as the ascension culture?
Sure. It's a part of our of a capitalist system gone
Yeah,
amok,
yeah.
right? It's it's built upon hundreds of years of, how else then, if we look at through an historic context, how else do wealthy Virginians convince poor white Virginians that the black slaves they're going to bring into their communities aren't competition. So what they do is they, in essence, say, well, you're going to be their bosses. You're not going to be on the bottom anymore. And then each new generation of slaves or indentured workers or whatever, each of them is given the dream. Well, if you work hard enough, if you, even amongst the slaves, right, they're led to believe that, well, if you work, if you do this, well, number one, you'll survive if you do what you're asked of. Otherwise, you won't live. But more important than that, if you take care of things, you'll get some small reward, right? So it's all built upon this idea that if we're fighting up these rungs, and these rungs are built upon this false narrative that if we keep striving, if we keep fighting, if we keep allowing this system of uh, hierarchy built into the ascension culture and built upon what others want us to do rather than we, in essence, saying, no, we're not going to do this. Now, there are individuals in our culture that don't have a choice. That's a rare instant. It does happen, right? It happened for African American slaves. They weren't given choices. But in the history of mankind, for the most part, people have had choice. They may not have liked their choices, but they had choices.
Mm.
And that element of choice is what we're in essence talking about today. But it's a different kind of choice. It's a willingness to say, I'm not going to battle to be the top of the rung, to be the expert. Instead, I'm going to tap into my own genius. I'm going to generate my own course. And I'm going to allow myself to live a journey that's about defined by my own sense of what is enough. What is enough for me? What is my version of enough? Right? And because we live in this world where all the jewels of living in this, capitalist culture are that's run amok are all built upon what's the next thing, the next jewel that I can be, placed can be placed in front of me that I'm going to strive for, whether it be technological advantages, whether it be,
Cars, the value that people put on their cars is astounding to me, frankly.
yeah, no, right, cars. Cars are a really great example. And it's understandable that a car be valued, but it's often valued as a status symbol rather than a safe utilitarian mode of getting around.
Indeed, indeed. That's what I was alluding to. So when we're with our beginner's mind, our inherent genius, living in capitalism run amok, sometimes it can feel like, for me, I'll give an example. Yesterday, I was walking from my friend's house in Richmond from one neighborhood on the East End, which is called Shockoe Bottom. And originally it was actually a slave market. And now it's become a commercial district with residential around it. And then I was walking through the financial district and government district. And I was just looking at my surroundings, experiencing them fully as they were. And there were a lot of buildings that were eroding, that were falling apart. And just across the street, there was a new building being put up, new condos, a parking lot being turned into, vertical real estate. And there was a sadness that I was feeling to that, noticing how there was neglect and there was this new growth. And they were right there. And they were right there, kind of competing for each other's space. And some of it had to do with gentrification. For me, walking and breathing and looking and seeing and feeling what came up for me through my curiosity, because I was looking and walking with this wonderment. I really wasn't wanting to start to analyze so much. And when I noticed that my mind would go there in comparing and contrasting this space, it was because of the sadness of how disconnected it felt, that these spaces were not about bringing about more community or bringing about sustainable growth. It was, how many apartment buildings can we build on this land that's just sat there unused or not used well enough? And all of these different things were flowing through me there. And I bring that up because it was an experience of my beginner's mind, my curiosity, and that sadness coming from capitalism run amok and feeling those edges that were really tough and wanting to veer into the expert because of that, wanting control at what I was seeing through the analytical. So I share that story in order to ask you, is that actually kind of a paradox? Is there really what I was experiencing was a form of abundance because I was feeling all of those different things and not setting any of them aside, and even the edges that felt rough, they had space. But I do start to fold in on myself a little bit. I do limit the possibilities to few when that expert's mind comes up. So I ask, what can we do? How can we be with ourselves when that expert's mind does take control?
Well, first off, I'm not sure how to bring it into the context of abundance. I do recognize that there's the opportunity at that particular moment to go, I don't know.
Ah,
I don't know. Because in essence, what you're seeing is what will ultimately be the homes of hundreds of people. Will they be luxury apartments? Will they be middle of the road kind of apartments? Will they be more low income apartments? I don't know. I'm not sure. And my gathering is you don't know either. And would it even matter? Is
mm,
there a market there? And is the market serving the community? I was listening the other day to the fact that housing in Los Angeles has become so expensive that people who can't afford Los Angeles are now moving into surrounding towns and cities.
yes, that's right.
Those individuals are, in essence, putting the same pressure on those towns and cities, those communities that Los Angeles has, driving up prices for those people. There's a reverberation, right? And I would offer, is there a right answer? Is there a wrong answer? When we think of the consequences of gentrification, because on the one hand, without gentrification, there's less development in our cities and people keep sprawling out into the suburbs. On the other hand, there's a benefit. Now, how to the community in the sense that the individuals who own homes in gentrified areas, they do experience the financial benefit of their homes increasing in value. On the other hand, at the same exact time, they lose the affordable homes that they were living in many ways, because generally they're forced out because of higher taxes, ever increasing costs of living.
Yes.
And those are the consequences of gentrification. And those very same individuals are forced out into other areas, therefore creating more pressure as they move into other houses, and that the housing pricing goes up. Now, capitalism will say to you, well, that's a good thing. We're creating more value for these homes, right? More wealth. My answer is maybe, because at a certain point, we end up with cities like Los Angeles where only the very wealthy can afford to live in them.
It's really that maybe and that I don't know that obviously there are things that we know, and what you stated now are things that we know that those things happen and are happening in this way. And there is a lot of maybe and I don't know there that speaks to Shoshin in the sense of being okay with it, right? That's what you had stated earlier, and it's something that we've talked about on the podcast before. The fact that I don't know doesn't have to be tied to the expert, the analytical, to problem solve, to worry about, to be anxious about. That I don't know can simply actually just be that. And when it's coming from the beginner's mind, it does go back, if it's tied to anything, the possibilities to consider. So, like with this subject that we're discussing now, the various possibilities to consider, and note that it's going to be different in different places. It's going to be different for different people. And those experiences are going to flow differently. And so, in many respects, it is about setting judgment aside. Beginner's mind has that wonderment and softness that a child does in tripping, falling over, making an adjustment, and by and large, most times, getting right back up. And there's a resiliency there because that curiosity at what the world is so powerful, so strong.
So if we come back to the first statement of Suzuki's quote, if your mind is empty,
Mm.
because it's a big if.
It is.
If your mind is empty, it is open to everything. If your mind is empty, then there's new possibilities as to any moment can offer you. And in that way, I'd like to introduce the notion of the mind as a tree. So every thought, every emotion represents at any given moment an extraordinary number of branches that we're all existing in. I say over the last 24, 48 hours, the last several days, the last several weeks, there's an extraordinary number of thoughts and feelings and reactions and responses that have arisen. Those are the branches of your mind. And in many ways, human beings exist believing that those branches is who they are. They define themselves by those feelings, by those thoughts. They see themselves through the lens of those branches. And when I challenge people, my students, my clients, on this notion that that's who they are, and challenge them and simply say, what if all these thoughts, all these feelings, in many ways, and most often expressed as anxieties or anticipations,
Mm.
worries or overthinking, frustrations or anger, deep sadnesses or depression, or just sadness in general, if I'm not those, then who am I? The question often arises.
Right.
And this is, in essence, what Shoshin is asking. If I'm not all those things, then what am I? My experience is that I observe myself as being something wholly different than when I existed largely in those many branches. That doesn't mean I don't have an experience of myself existing within the many branches. However, my practice is to continue to bring myself down to the trunk existing as a single arising through creation, right? And as a result, I'm connected to the ability to connect with my wisdom, my unique genius, not anyone else's, my unique genius. my unique creative life force. And what arises from there as I practice with that is the recognition that while I don't have answers for everyone, I don't have answers for the world as a whole. I do have answers for myself, answers that arise largely from what I call my wisdom, and what I would largely suggest is wisdom that exists within all of us when we listen to the whispering voice that arises out of the deep quiet, out of the stillness,
Mm.
out of what Suzuki calls empty. And from there, a sense of calling arises, a sense of clarity that allows the movement forward. That sense of calling allows for the movement into the next moment and the moment after that to be a radically different experience than if we are striving within the ascension myths belief that if we just keep striving, if we keep pushing, if we keep working harder and harder and harder, and we keep abandoning who and what we are at our very core, we'll somehow succeed. It's a myth. It's a false narrative built upon the belief that if we do this, will ultimately land someplace that has a deep sense of truth, a deep sense of ease. And while that may be true for some small number, my experience is the vast majority of us wake up the next day asking the question, what now? And that's what I'm offering in this work. Here's where to go when you arrive at that what now? I've been doing this, I've been battling with this for years. What now? Well, the what now that I offer is deeply getting to know yourself through a mind that is empty, or at least a practice that takes oneself in that direction. It doesn't arrive instantaneously. I won't make false promises to anyone, and I never do. This belief that you start meditating and everything changes. You start looking at yourself authentically and everything changes. It does begin to change within months, and it will take years. And in the midst of it, of practicing it, life does intrinsically change. There is peace in being open to the world and to the road ahead of you. There is ease in knowing that there are an infinite number of possibilities, but there need only be one that's true for you.
O tranquility, penetrating the very rock, a cicada's voice. If you'd like to keep in touch with Martin on anything related to Language of the Soul, the podcast, the paperback, the audiobook, and especially the course, you can go over to martinperkins.com, martinperkins.com. If you are enjoying this podcast, it would be an incredible gift for you to go over and give us a review and give us a 5-star rating, particularly on Apple Podcasts, if that's your platform of choice. Any of the platforms have a review process to go through. Writing something kind about what you're getting out of the podcast does help with visibility and getting out there on those platforms in terms of the algorithm, picking that up and putting it into the view of other potential listeners. So that would be greatly appreciated. Reviews and ratings on multiple platforms. Thank you so much for joining us today in this experience of the moment unfolding. With an empty mind, everything is possible. Everything is open.